the Center for Global Agenda at Unbuilt Labs has convened the next panel discussion on health policy, research infrastructure, and health for all with moderators Marvin, Cheung, and myself. We're pleased to welcome Ivy Kwan Arce, board member of Treatment Action Group and Research in Action Award honoree, Rachele Hendricks-Sturrup, Research Director on Real-World Evidence at Duke-Margolis Center for Health Policy, and Steve MacFeely, Director of Data and Analytics at World Health Organization. In Steve's statement, he describes a global data compact that would constitute an integrated set of data principles and standards that unite national governments, public institutions, private sector, civil society organizations, and academia. These would include elements such as privacy of personal data, data accessibility, data exchange, data interoperability, and transparency. He also raises the issue that data offers promise, but also peril. They are a tool for liberation, but also potentially a weapon for exploitation. Our topics for today's discussion include data privacy, the future of clinical research, and engagement with civil society. We would like to invite our panel to discuss these topics and identify questions for further research. So welcome, and we'd like to begin with the first topic, data privacy. And let me throw this out to you guys. Can you describe how data privacy relates to your current work? Who can I invite somebody to start, or would you?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. Oh,
okay, very good.
No. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm happy to be here. My name is Dr. Rachele Hendricks-Sturrup. I'm, as I was introduced, the Research Director of Real World Evidence at the Duke-Margolis Center for Health Policy in Washington, D.C. Really happy to talk about data privacy within the context of real world data and also broader contexts that consider big data, which many argue is quite different from the context of what we call real world data. Real world data is largely applied to the regulatory context. So thinking about FDA or the US Food and Drug Administration, and then also the European Medicines Agency, Health Canada, and others that oversee or regulate medical products. They consider data from a variety of different sources, whether it's from a healthcare system, Fitbit watch, the internet, through social media or your email, whatever that might be, that falls under the bucket or definition of real world data. Again, thinking about the regulatory context, but then as we consider big data, that's data that's outside of regulatory context that have more real world or broader, additional real world and broader implications. Now, the thing is, given that the data comes from a variety of sources, the data may or may not be de-identified or identifiable. And then also, given that the data can travel at the speed of light across oceans and across time within seconds, the data can be transferred to different legal jurisdictions. So thinking about the United States and the state of our privacy policy landscape, and then comparing that to, say, that of the European landscape, which many argue is a bit more robust and protective over data privacy and discretion. So as we think about privacy, there are a lot of implications here, and there are many different levels. We think about protecting the discretion of the data itself, protecting the system in which the data is collected or exchanged, and then also thinking about the ways in which the data can be engineered or re-engineered to obscure the identities of the data subjects. So those are broad considerations that I often think about, that my colleagues think about within the health policy landscape with respect to data, whether it's real world data, big data, or otherwise.
Thank you. Ivy, can I ask you to jump in? You're muted. Hang on. There you go.
Yeah. Well, I'm actually interested of, like, that inequality of access to data. I mean, while data is really important, but I think, like, the impact of what we consider protective data here, the impact what that does in different countries as well. What makes you vulnerable while you're still a commodity of information. that can help solve a lot of issues, but then that same commodity can put you in danger as well. So those are the kind of concerns, like as active as humans, especially when you're tasked with a certain issue, whether it's a virus in your body or a mobilizing community, what does that look like when data is important? Is the only place like clinical trial, you have to have some kind of infrastructure where the person that is data is being extracted has some kind of boundary and understanding that that's happening.
Thank you. Steve, I saw you were trying to get to your equipment and having a moment.
Yeah, I think what we can do is we'll let all the speakers have a first round of sort of presentation, speaking, and then Shadi will get to you after Steve.
Okay, so should I speak?
Yes, please do. I saw you were
Okay.
trying to get your tech together, which is always
Yeah, apologies. I'm
None
coming
of
to you
it.
from Paris, and in fact, I'm just leaving a meeting at UNESCO where we're talking about these very issues. So, from a World Health Organization, obviously we deal with a lot of sensitive information. So, as official statisticians, our job is to ensure that we don't breach confidentiality, either inadvertently or deliberately, obviously. And health data is particularly sensitive. I mean, if you take something like AIDS or hepatitis, in some countries, that may be taken as an indicator of sexual preference, and that in itself then may be illegal. So we have to be really, really careful around the use and the access to data. But more globally, then obviously the WHO is part of the UN system. And as I mentioned, I just had a meeting today where we're discussing a forthcoming summit in 2024 called Summit of the Future. And that a large measure of that summit will deal with data issues, and in particular data governance. So the whole issue of privacy, the human rights aspects of data, in fact, whether even access to your own data should become a human right. And these are all of the types of issues that we're discussing. So trying to balance data privacy without restricting the opportunities that data presents. So you read out that piece from my submission where I said, you know, data can be a tool, but it can also be dangerous. And that's where we're trying to strike a balance between the two. We don't want to limit opportunities that data can provide, but we want to restrict or try and mitigate against the worst misuses and abuses of data, and try and protect individuals and communities. So I'll stop there for the moment. Thank you.
So maybe we should move on to our second topic, which leads out from that.
Wait, maybe before we do that, yes, Shadi.
Did Shadi have something to say? Sorry, I missed the...
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in a little bit because actually a lot of what I do application has to do with cryptography and identity and self-sovereign identity as a key cornerstone for how we think of intellectual ownership as well as patient and data privacy. So it's fascinating. I think like if you work meaningfully with data, you know, trying to transform it or use it to make decisions or analyze it, right? You end up finding that provenance is really important. And if you follow the branches of provenance, you know, the history of data to its root, it always goes down to an identity, right? There always has to be an identity that commits that data, that transforms that data, that signs off that data. So data and identity seem, at least in my mind, completely intertwined and very difficult to dissociate if you're trying to build resilient systems that are private and self-owned. This conversation also really reminds me too of the UN's Convention on the Rights of the Child, right? So I'm sure you all have more expertise and knowledge regarding that, but a key provision is that the granting of every living person with the most basic right? The right to have an identity. And I think this naturally extends to data, right? So typically these identities will include data such as your name, date of birth, nationality, or like maybe like a social security number or something that's issued by the state. This is a very kind of patriarchal way of thinking about systems, right? Where you kind of have this granting of your identity, attestation of your identity. Anyway, so I'm just gonna wrap up there, but I do want to put something on your radars called zero knowledge proof systems. And they're in the realm of cryptography, also with homeomorphic encryption systems that allow us to prove things about people without revealing that data in the first place. And I think these technologies are going to have a major, major impact in how we think about privacy and identity on the internet, moving away from centralized state-issued or Facebook-issued or Google-issued claims on identity to attestate who you are and why you what you are, and you know what I'm saying.
Thank you, Shadi. Ivy, would you like to comment?
So one of the things that would be interesting to work through in the future is who are the governors, who are the good people, who's really guarding this. For example, you're doing the genetic testing of your heritage, right, or whatever that is. The transfer of acquisition in business is something nobody really monitors that, right? So you think it was Facebook, or you're trying to find your heritage. That's one company, and in a couple of years it gets sold, and there's no. It's the same way when we update our phone, we have to say yes, otherwise we can't really go to the next phase. So it really doesn't give any sense of ownership of your own data, and that's it's so easily bypassed, and that's also bypassed by certain governors of elections in different countries. Every 4 years, especially in this country, things can change. Whatever was an understanding 4 years ago may not be. Other countries have a longer longevity in terms of building things and fixing things as they go. But I think the future, especially when we have the younger generations born into this acceptance of accepting. I mean, even the whole exchange of Apple now saying, do you want, or websites telling you, do you really want to share this or go under and personalize that? Most people don't do that, or it's written in a way that you just say yes. So the governance of who you think is good or who dictates that are the safekeepers is a huge issue that needs to be defined.
Yeah, Rachel, Marvin and I are excited that people are responding. Great, thank you, Rachel. You're muted.
It never fails. No, both of you raised very salient points. So to the point about the right to an identity, I think when we think about identity, going back to my comment about layers, there I think two key layers to this, at least within the human experience and context. We have the right to be individuals, and we have a right to have that identity. And then with that comes ideals around individualism. And then there are community level considerations that certainly have privacy implications as well, such as protecting the identity of a community, such that the community has sovereign rights as a community, as an identifiable and self-identifying community, and then the privacy of that community and the discretion of their data should therefore be acknowledged within the broader policy context. But then to Ivy's point, about commoditizing data, whether it's data about an individual or data about a population or a subpopulation, I think we also have to think about what was the basis for creating identity. I think ultimately it boils down to the fact that identity was a way of creating order within a system. And then with that order came the ability to protect assets within that system. It's arguably paternalistic, but at the end of the day, there's a financial or sort of asset management component to that. And we see that with companies as well, to Ivy's point, whereas, a company like a direct-to-consumer genetic testing company can acquire an individual's genetic data in exchange for a genetic profile about that person. So really appealing to that person's desire to be understood as an individual. They've commoditized that. And then separately, they have figured out a way to also use the data that they acquire to conduct generalizable research, but then also engage in further commoditizing of the data to serve a financial purpose that is solely owned by that company's or solely within that company's interest, that company's identity. So the data can be used to create new drugs. It can be sold to the data itself can be sold to drug companies. Those are just two examples. So I think, again, data has introduced a whole an entirely different way of understanding the identity of an individual. And then droves of data have also led to the identities of communities and companies and so forth. And so again, with that comes, especially when one community or individual disagrees with another, or when one individual or community is more at risk of exploitation versus another. So I just wanted to throw that in. Great points.
Yeah, very good points. I think we might extend this for another 12 minutes or so, so until 6:30, if that's okay with everyone. It's a very productive and very informative conversation. And I felt like Rachel's comments really is a very good segue into the second topic that we have. What is your vision for the future of clinical research and how it intersects with data privacy and health for all? Ivy, would you like to?
Can you repeat that? Because there was a lot of sections to that.
Okay, of course. So what is your vision for the future of clinical research and how it intersects with data privacy and health for all?
I think that is very different in different parts of the globe, right? And it goes back to, for us in the US, is a cyclical 4 years, what that means. And then it gets override by the kind of economics that we have, which is capitalism. And how, the structures of governments do not protect that individual. Because we have competition, and it's allowed to have as many layers as capitalism will require to extract the goods and personalize it for you, and that drives what gets studied and who, and I think like what I found interesting was to watch COVID play out after being HIV positive for 32 years. Most diseases where clinical trials happen, most communities don't know who are the participants, versus like in HIV, we adamantly shape those clinical trials and force the government to be part of that planning with us, versus like pharmaceuticals will draw out their goals, and we drew our goals, and we summon each other to come to participate in that. We summon ourselves to know when side effects were too much and change the safety program. And COVID had a little of that history mixed in, because the people working in that affair was some people of the same history. Unless you have that, it's very disassociated. It goes back to, bigger companies taking whatever and drawing the product design of that clinical trial and their outcome. And without that participation in the individual, and that's a lack of history of what individuals can do. And that's the part that for me has been really hard to stay in community, to tell that story, that one needs to participate. And even in a short 4 years frame, like in this country, if you don't have that, you really lose the little control that you have as a consumer, and as somebody that could even be in a path for health recovery.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have 8 or so minutes left. I think what I want to do is actually to move into the third topic, because I know that's a topic that Steve in particular have talked about. So, and the topic is on civil society engagement. What are the ways of engaging with civil society that you have found to be effective? Steve, would you like to take this question?
Yeah, and I think that really leads on, just to say that leads out of what Ivy was saying, that we've seen one model, and I'd be interested to hear a different model.
Well, it's a great question, and I wish I had a good answer. It's the thing that's actually keeping us awake at night. As we sit there kind of discussing at the UN kind of data governance models, the kind of realization is the traditional UN model was to engage with member states. But when we're talking about data governance, discussing with member states alone isn't going to cut it. So we need to engage with private sector, which is challenging because that in itself is a homogeneous group or a heterogeneous group. But the biggest challenge is, how do we engage with civil society? How do we engage with the individuals? Because every individual is being impacted by the developments in the data world. And it's a real challenge because the UN isn't really geared up to communicating with individuals. It's really designed to communicate with governments. And this is a big challenge. So here we are on one hand discussing data governance kind of in the abstract, trying to formulate good policies. But when we go to do the consultation piece, how do we do it? We can organize regional sessions, and that will be important because there'll be different cultural views. And I could spend a lifetime just talking about what Rachele had said a few minutes ago, because I think that was really interesting. But that's still not enough. So, you know, we're looking at online options. We're looking at all sorts of things. But honestly, I don't know. I mean, this is the big challenge. I mean, how do you communicate effectively with 8 billion people, 1 billion of whom at least don't even have a legal identity? And how do we talk to them about having an identity and having data? Because that's the reality that we face now. We all have multiple identities now. We don't even know how many we have. Like, as a thought experiment, could you imagine if you woke up tomorrow morning and all of the databases where your data exists were just wiped? It'd be a great book. So you wake up in the morning, nothing works. So here I am, I physically exist, but in every other sense of the word, I wouldn't exist anymore. So this is what we're trying to grapple with. So what I would do is I turn around the question to the rest of the panel and say, if anybody's got any good ideas, I would love to hear them, because this is the piece that's really worrying us. How do we have this discussion with 8 billion people? Not a very satisfactory answer, I know, but thank you.
Well, no, I think what you just highlighted is that we live in this gray area of identity and in the 21st century. We obviously have our physical identity, whether it's legal or illegal, and we also have a digital identity. And quite frankly, not having a digital identity these days, as an adult, that is, it's very dangerous. In fact, you can quickly fall behind. I mean, there are some people who might disagree with that in one way or another, but the fact of the matter is, as you mentioned, is that today, in order to navigate our world and its complexities, and in order to navigate day-to-day living, you have to have some form of digital identity, whether it's minuscule or maximum. And then obviously, you know, again, with that comes this huge gray area that one has to choose to live in on a certain spectrum. And that's certainly up to the individual. It's certainly not up to them if they are born somewhere where having a digital identity is mandatory. And I think that introduces an entirely different level of human rights that we need to consider, obviously. And you're right, we are still in the process of disentangling all of that, especially from a policy standpoint. And then also, you know, trying to build in some of the cultural aspects that accompany one's sense of identity as well. You know, trying to reconcile digital identity with community identity or individual identity. There are some cultural contentions even within that, whereas in some places, having an individual have an individualistic, I would say, perspective of oneself is not quite welcome, whereas it's the community's identity that you need to be more concerned about. So we haven't even figured it out as human beings, but now we've added in the 21st century, again, another layer to understanding what identity means by creating a digital world that we must live in, as you mentioned, in order to survive. So I don't have the answer to that question, but I do have questions we can ask ourselves to get to the answer.
Ivy, would you like to sort of provide some closing thoughts and your experience working with different vulnerable populations?
Something that Shadi did put in there, the spinal cord patient. I think at the end of the day, whether it's healthcare in this particular case, or a direct consumer, and obviously healthcare is a very it's where you mark your path in life and your endpoint. So it's a very different conversation than a consumer in any other way. And the only way I've seen it work is that the higher ups and the people on the ground do have to participate in one way. Otherwise, either this balance has never shown to work. And many models where patients were included, and that takes time in terms of like when you're talking to people like in higher ends in science and policymaker, the people on the ground need that space and that time to learn to be able to be in that table. And then you have to create the table for them to come to you, which that's the reflection with HIV, especially here in New York, is that at one point, the people that inherently are living with the challenges do not have to navigate their daily lives with all this heavy policy of how you're supposed to behave in a workspace. That governance of the person that is dealing with its own illness with the right tools of very specific education. When we say educate, you should be educated. The education has to be very, very specific, and you have to be very militant about learning it and exploring the challenges in order to participate. Other than that, it just looks like what always seems very separate, a separate project, and they're not considering the person, the conditions, and that has shown that is going to be old science. It's old science already. We are in a time where medications are going to be customized. Therefore, the environments that higher policy people or research is doing can only function more efficiently when the patient is educated enough to participate and help shape those clinical trials. And that time and time has been like the success of HIV, and that's you can see it in different parts of population globally, that when they took those environments that were allowed where the patient is educated enough that can have also the space of being as valuable as the policymaker or the research person, is when it works the best.
Thank you. Wow.
Thank you, everyone, for your time and expertise. As always, our time is short, and we would like to thank all of you for your leadership and insight today. And we would be moving on to our next section very shortly. So,
can I just add my thanks to, everything that's been said today is absolutely fascinating, thought-provoking, and that's really why we wanted to get together, to get this kind of insight and to hear from different perspectives. So I, for one, really thank everybody for contributing. Been really, really great thus far. And I'm excited to hear our next speaker as well. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks for having
Thank you.
us.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.